And then after that, I'll give you my approach, and then we'll look at a specific sample of my reading of Revelation. So I chose a passage that a lot of people are interested in. And if we go through these, I know the terms are a bit long, but these are the terms that have been given to us. So the first one is this idealist perspective. See on page 1 of that chart. Did you want me to keep it? The idealist, or the poetic or symbolic, and this is a reading of Revelation that focuses on the book as timeless principles or timeless truths. It would read the book more figuratively than it would literally. And so when they come to the book of Revelation, they open it up and they see God fighting a battle against the forces of darkness or the forces of Satan. And we shouldn't look to specific events in history that refer to this ongoing story in the book of Revelation. So that's the idealist or more poetic reading. And this is an interpretive approach that's most common in Presbyterian circles or Reformed circles. The next one is, and I apologize, it's a big term, a preterist reading, which is just another fancy way of saying a past reading, or historical critical. And that's a way of reading the book of Revelation that focuses just on the book as being fulfilled in the first century. And so all of the events refer to specific people or ideas or things in the first century and not anything else. So we shouldn't look for the book to find a fulfillment today. There's nothing in the book that talks about something from 21st century or behind it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam.
The third view, and the preterist historical critical, is probably, I would think that would be the view that most mainline churches, like Episcopal churches, would hold to. And they would be dissecting the text historically and looking at its fulfillment for first century Christians, but not for later day Christians. The next view is the futurist or a dispensational reading of the book, and that looks at this book as entirely predictive. And although the first few chapters, the letters that are written to the 7 churches, refer to something that was in the past, everything after that is something that will occur in the future and toward the end of the destruction of the world. And those are the people who offer that really flat reading of Scripture. So I mentioned that last week, but I brought an illustration today. And you know, when you think about the Bible is really a pop-up book. So there's all these hills and mountains, and those hills and mountains are figurative language, it's poetry. There's lots of different genres or literary styles. So that's the way the Bible is, and it's supposed to be interpreted that way. But a flat reading is when you just push this down, and you don't recognize that actually it's supposed to have these hills and mountains to help us interpret it. So that is what a flat reading of Revelation does, is it makes you focus specifically on events in the future. Because you're reading it in violation of rule number 1 that I gave last week as literature. You're not recognizing the complexity of the language used, that it was never meant to be interpreted flatly like that. But that's the futurist reading. That's the reading that probably most of us know is the most common in American churches. Or at least that's the view with the people with the loudest voices. So if you turn on the television and you're hearing someone talk about Revelation, they are almost always speaking about it as predictive. They almost always are dispensationalists offering a flat reading. You don't ever hear, I've never heard anyone on TV offering a preterist or historical critical or another approach. It's always this predictive, and that is representative of American churches. So we are the largest purveyors, I think, of that reading of Scripture for the entire world. So the Les Behind series, of course, is an example, or Hal Lindsey's written many books, The Late Great Planet Earth, which have sold millions and millions of copies around the world. The next reading is an historicist reading, and this looks at the book of Revelation as being fulfilled throughout the many churches' ages. So, for instance, an event in Revelation 9 could be fulfilled in the 13th century, and then an event in Revelation 18 could be fulfilled in the 18th century. But it's just talking about the ongoing continuation of the church. This was a view that was somewhat common during the Reformation time, but it's not as common today. Most reformers, by the way, did not talk much about Revelation. John Calvin and Martin Luther didn't write commentaries on the books. They didn't have many sermons on the books for a variety of reasons, but they thought that it was a book for Calvin. He just thought it was not very helpful, and for Luther, he thought the same thing. He just didn't think that it should probably be in the canon. The last view is the correct way to read it, and we know that because it has the longest word that you've probably never said before, and specifically because it's in bold. Well, this is my approach, and I'm just joking. It's the recapitulationist view, and it is a horribly unfortunate word, but that is the best way, I think, to describe it. And this approach uses the best of each one of the views above. So the idealist, which looks at it more figuratively and poetic, I think is hitting on some aspects that are true. The preterist reading, in that if you're going to look for a specific fulfillment or referent, you should look for the first century and not anything afterward. The futurist, where there is still an aspect of this is going to happen in the future, it's not been culminated, it hasn't climaxed yet. And the historicist, which it has been ongoing, but specifically the recapitulationist view, which I'm going to say is what this book describes is the uncreation of the world in 6 different days, and it's told in different perspectives. So if you look at that quote right below from Vern Poythress, The Return of the King, he also has a recapitulationist view, which is a little different from mine, but I like this quote. I think it's right. He says, the major symbols of Revelation represent a repeated pattern, and I put of repeated cycles, or as I call them, repeated days. This pattern has a realization in the first century situation of the 7 churches, and that's because John is writing in the first century, and therefore all of the ideas that he talks about are an allusion in some way to the first century. At the same time, it also has an embodiment in the final crisis, in the future, and it has an embodiment now. And so the way I like to describe Revelation as it's already happened, it is happening, and it will happen in the future. It has happened, it is happening, it will happen in the future. But we should not look for it all to be future predictive in that sense. So it's just talking about an ongoing reality in the church of what I think specifically are the uncreation of the world, so that the world can be recreated in the last 2 days, the last 2 chapters of Revelation. So, you see a little outline which we don't have to talk about, but I'll just, one more quote from Poythress there on page 60. It says that quote on the first page. It says, the cycles, and I'll give you my cycles in just a moment, the cycles parallel one another. All cover the same period leading up to the second coming, but each cycle does so from its own distinct vantage point. Moreover, later cycles concentrate more and more on the most intense phases of conflict and on the second coming itself. So, I'll give you a handout with these different cycles that I mentioned, but first just want to check, see if you have any comments or any questions.
I have a question, Derek, because I think I missed some of it. But these different viewpoints that are at the top, are they just different biblical scholars, what they identify? Okay, so the recapitulist, that last one, recapitulationist one, is that that's well known also, or is that in scholarly or not so much?
I've not heard it as much. That's something that is alluded to in some ways, but there's not a consensus on that exact term. So I don't know of a lot of people who have that. I know of a few people, and I've looked, I think I've traced back, maybe I was reading a 4th century commentary on Revelation, and a guy has a very similar view, but he doesn't use the word recapitulations or anything.
Okay.
So the first time I think I saw that term was Vern Poitras. I think he might use something like that in one of his
Okay, so this author, the read, okay.
But I've seen other people since then have a similar view, but they don't call it a recapitulations.
Okay,
So these other ones are terms that are more well known.
okay, all right. Thanks.
Any other comments or questions? And so you realize that the book of Revelation is a challenging book, and it's different from almost all other books of the Bible where we have to clarify before we get started what our approach to it is. Because if you don't clarify that, then you're going to come to a contrary reading of what's going on. So most people, at least in America, assume that the book of Revelation is a predictive book, and it's describing the end of the world, specifically what's going to happen at the end. And that's how we should read it. And so that flat reading of Scripture, where specifically these things will happen in the future. But I've told you before, I think that's a fundamentally flawed way to read that book. And that's not to say that other books of the Bible should not be read that way. So I think we talked about this a little last week, but in the first hour, we actually never got around to the book of Revelation because we had so many questions about how to read literature that we really never came around to talking as much about Revelation. But one of those things was just to say it's a fundamentally flawed way to read Revelation flatly. We should read certain parts of the New Testament flatly, and thinking, for instance, of some of the letters of Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about the tradition that was been given over to me, that Jesus died in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was resurrected in accordance with the Scriptures. I think it's never appropriate to read the Bible flatly, but to read that literally according to he's giving factual information that should be understood accordingly. But he's writing a specific type of literature that necessitates that. If he were writing poetry, which he's not there, and he does have poems in his letters, then that necessitates that we have to read that understanding it's poetry. And so when he says something like that, we shouldn't assume that it's scientifically verifiable in the sense that he would expect something more along just a regular letter. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying that a literal reading of Scripture is inappropriate. I'm only saying that it is inappropriate, I think, or it's unfitting to the genre for the book of Revelation. And that's getting back to our conversation last week. It's apocalyptic literature, and I showed you that big, massive book, which I have again this week. You read all these, and it's doing the same exact thing. It's apocalyptic literature. It's more figurative language. That's the common way of saying it. So what we can do today is we can do one of two things. I do have two different types of handouts. One, if you would like to talk more about some of this apocalyptic literature, I do have a couple of chapters from some of those books to show you some commonalities between that and Revelation. And that would take a few minutes, or we could jump directly into Revelation and we could work through a specific cycle. So, anyone have a preference? We should have time for both, but
I think
we'll spend as
we're
much
in
time.
the process of so many of us of reading Revelation. My preference would be to look at Revelation and then the other apocalyptic issues by reference, perhaps.
We can do that. So, all right. Thanks, dear. So, I have chosen, which I think to be the most common cycle in the sense of this is the cycle that most people want to know information about. And that has 666 in it. Everybody wants to know what 666 means. And fortunately, I do know what it means. Humbly said, of course, yeah. I have another one, I think. If we need another one?
No, that's
Okay,
fine.
you've got them all?
That's an extra.
You have an extra? Perfect. So, if you look on the top of page 1, I have my different cycles, and I've called them days, and so I'll just put that. What I think is, technically, the term that I like is there's 6 days of uncreation. So I call them cycles here, just because it might be too much of a stretch to tell you what I'm really thinking, and that there's 6 days of uncreation. Obviously, the days are not literal days, they're figurative days. But I think that John, who there's no doubt about it, was immersed in the Old Testament, and he is recapitulating the early part of Genesis. And so just as in Genesis 1 to 3, we have 2 creation accounts. We have the 6 days of creation and everything that comes about. John recapitulates those 6 days, and he does the opposite. So instead of the 6 days of creation, he has 6 days of uncreation, and then that will be followed by the recreation of the world. Does that make sense? Even though it may not make sense? So, for my different days, that is my chart, or cycles, and the first one actually should be chapter 6, it doesn't begin in chapter 4. But chapter 1 is the introduction to the book. Chapter 2 and 3 have the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Chapters 4 and 5 have the throne room scene where John is taken up to heaven and he sees what's going on. And then it's in chapter 6 where the book really begins, because that's when the 7 seals of destruction commence, and then after that, the whole uncreation begins. And so chapter 6 all the way to chapter 8 has those 7 seals of destruction. And so the world is uncreated by means of 7 seals. In the second cycle, chapter 8 to chapter 11, the world is uncreated in 7 trumpets of destruction. And each time one of these trumpets is blown, another part of the world is destroyed, whether it's the air or whether it's the water or earth. And then the third cycle is 7 histories of people and things, and that will be followed by the destruction of the world, where Jesus, along with another angel, will reap or harvest the earth. And for each one of these, it's important to realize, I think that it ends. So the end of the world comes, but at the same time, the story keeps on going. And in this way, it's not sequential in the sense that you have to understand it for predictive. And so chapter 7 happens historically, and then chapter 8 happens, and then chapter 9 happens. I think it's best to understand it as thematic, and so there's different themes. A different destruction takes place. That story is told, and then John tells it from a slightly different perspective. And he keeps doing that, which again, it's really strange for us, but I think it's clear that he's doing something along those lines. And in fact, you have to have some view like this, because by the time the last cycle comes, there's nothing left to destroy. Everything's been destroyed. There's no people left, really. There's no animals. There's no creation. So the only thing left is it's like a tree and a red dragon or something. That's the only thing left. And no wonder the last battle is so anticlimactic, because it's just, well, there's the tree and the dragon right there. Just take them out. You know, we don't have to go to any battle because there's nothing left to destroy. I mean, it's like what happened to Ulrich Zwingli, the famous reformer. After he was killed, he said to his followers, I want you to burn my body, because I know what the Catholics are going to do to me. So, unfortunately, his followers didn't get his body like he wanted. So the Catholics, they, of course, they did the customary chopping off of body parts, quartered in. Then they burn his corpse with feces, and then they dragged it all throughout, and many other things. But
Happy story.
yeah, this is what Christians do to Christians. That's the true story.
They wanted
This is
it.
how we treat our own. Yeah. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is once he died, there was really no point in doing these other things to his corpse. But that's what's going on in Revelation. If you take it sequentially, there's nothing left to destroy if you don't have an approach somewhat like I do. So let's go for the third day of uncreation. And again, I chose this one because if anyone wants to know something, they want to know what the 666 means. And so we can talk about that. So if you want to turn to Revelation, we can just work through one of these cycles. If you look at chapter 12, someone especially feel like they'd like to read out loud? Okay, all right, Craig, do you mind reading chapter 12?
The entire chapter.
Yeah, we'll do the whole chapter.
Okay. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains in the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea.
Nice story. And by the way, I should mention, when I say people read the Bible flatly or literalistically, there's no one who can read Revelation flatly consistently. That is, read the Bible or read Revelation flatly 100% of the time. So even people who offer very flat reading of Scripture have to recognize that there's actually not a dragon. And it says so explicitly here in chapter 12. The dragon is Satan, or the devil, the great serpent. So no one does it that way, even though they will quibble people who don't do that. So they will say, you read this symbolically or figuratively, you're not supposed to. And then you say, well, what about this passage right here? Well, this is different. You're supposed to read it literally, but this one's different because it says so here, or something else. And it just goes on and on from there. But I think it's pretty clear when you read this chapter and many other chapters, these events are not happening as they're described, right? Would everyone agree with that? There is not a red dragon. There's not a woman who's given birth to a baby, literally in this sense. There is not, we'll see the 144,000, these strange creatures, and then eventually these different beasts coming out. Those represent something else. And so the question is not, is there a red dragon? The question is, what does the red dragon represent? And here, that one is made explicit. The other ones are not made as explicit.
In that context, one of the things that intrigues me is the mathematical references. So you mentioned you wipe out a third with this one, and a third, another third, and then, like you say, eventually nothing's left. But there's times and time and a half times, and then you hear of people that use these numbers to conjure up when the end of the world will occur and that sort of thing. So it certainly bears out what you're saying, but I'm quite fascinated, and I think you may have some reference to numbers later on.
Yeah, if you actually turn the page over, we can look at that now. So, as I mentioned before, on page 2, the little chart that has different links explaining same events. You have that page? Page 2. And the thing that's interesting is people don't recognize, which I don't know how, given that there's so much evidence in front of us, that these numbers are not meant to be taken literally. That every number, I would say clearly in the book of Revelation, is a figurative number. It's a symbolic number that represents something. And so on this little chart here, I've kind of put together the different time frames that are mentioned in Revelation. And you see how they're all hitting at the same thing. So times, 2 times, and half a times. Half a week, 42 months, 1,260 days. 2 times, and half a time, or 42 months. Or some people say 3.5 years. It's all referring to the same thing. And specifically, if you want a historic reference, I think that there's good reason for us to assume that it's referring to the 3 years that Antiochus Epiphanes had the temple in Jerusalem, from 167 to 164. And the end of that, as I mentioned last week, is Hanukkah. So when the Maccabees, some Jewish zealots, finally took control of the temple after 3 years of it being defiled and desecrated, they rededicated it, and that's what Hanukkah means, is rededication. But that time frame was traumatic for the Jewish people. They had never experienced anything like that before, where, I mean, the temple had been destroyed before, but after they had rebuilt it, for someone to actually take control of it for several years and to be using it for pagan purposes, it was such a traumatic time for them, and that was a signal of a new time period for them. And that's a time period that was still in existence when Jesus was around. Although the Jews technically had control over the temple, they were still oppressed by the Roman Empire. And so Antiochus Epiphanes represents all that is pagan and evil about the world. And so I think that's the historical reference in the book of Daniel. It's talking about those types of things. And then that, of course, is taken by the book of Revelation and spun in different ways. So whether it's 42 months, or whether it's 1,260 days, or so forth, or 3.5 years. But I think it then came to symbolize a time of intense persecution when the pagans were in control or winning. And that's in contrast to when the church was reigning. And so, as I mentioned, these different things here, starting with Revelation 11, the pagans trample out on the outer temple court for 42 months. And that's referring to the outer temple is where the Gentiles were allowed to be. And then 1,260 days below that, also in chapter 11, this is when the 2 prophets prophesy in the city. And to me, the 2 prophets, it makes more sense to understand. That's just representative of the church. The 2 prophets are the church. And then after that, the 1,260 days again, and that's what we see in Revelation 12, when the woman is protected from the dragon. And she's going to go into the desert. The desert in the Bible is paradoxically a place of refuge, and it's also a place of trial and testing. And the two go hand in hand. So the woman, and if you turn back on page 1, I'll show you. I think the woman symbolizes the church or the people of God. And she's clearly persecuted by the dragon. As we know, the dragon is Satan or the devil. And he's also the first in the unholy trinity. So, I probably mentioned last week, we have the Trinity, and then what the book of Revelation does so often, it has counterfeits. So we have God, let's say Father. We have Father, Son, and Spirit. And so the counterfeit to each one of these is in this section that we're in. So the counterfeit to the Father is the dragon. And the authority that he has mirrors the Father of the authority of the Father, but of course it's counterfeit. And then the Son does not equal the first beast, and he will have a lot of commonalities between the Son, and he is a counterfeit of the Son. And the last person in the Holy Trinity is either the second beast or the false prophet. He's called two different names. First, he's called the second beast, but then later on he's called the false prophet. And his job as the false prophet is to attest to the beast. And the beast, of course, is made in the image of the dragon. So the same thing is true for here. The Spirit attests to the work of Jesus, Jesus in God's image. So that is what we see throughout this cycle, is how these three beings emerge. And they are counterfeits of the Holy Trinity. Any questions on that before we move into the next chapter? We'll continue in this cycle.
I guess, just reading that passage flat, I guess this would be reading it flatly. I assumed the woman was Mary. Yeah, I mean, that's probably what I think a lot of people assume. But I like that you defined it as the church,
Yeah.
the people of God.
And yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we do. But the thing that I think that we should always remember is, how can we be consistent? And consistency is the key. And so some people would argue that the numbers in the book of Revelation are symbolic until it comes to the 1,000 years, and then it is literal.
Yeah.
And people actually, there are people who claim that. And so the question we say to them lovingly is, well, if every other number in Revelation is symbolic, then why is this number an exception? And I don't think it is an exception. I think that they're all symbolic. That's the right answer. But the same thing comes to this, and so it's easy, right? Just straightforward. We say, yeah, the woman is Mary. And I would say that would be fine if we didn't have these other descriptions which are clearly symbolic. So if the other ones are clearly symbolic, then we have to go also with the symbolic reading of the woman. And besides, Mary, was she ever robed with the sun, and did she stand on the moon?
Right. You can't take it literally,
Yeah.
but the sentence that you want to, is that she
gave birth to her son.
to the child. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so,
Right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So we want to go for that, but I don't. Maybe my version is different, but I don't remember her standing on the moon in the gospel, right? All right, let's move on. Pam, do you want to read chapter 13 for us?
Sure.
And this is the famous chapter, the infamous one. 13. Chapter 13.
Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" The beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. Let anyone who has an ear to listen. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you killed with the sword you must be killed. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth, and had 2 horns like a lamb on it, spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. It performs great signs, even making a fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom, that let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666.
There you have it.
Now we know.
Now we know. It's all been clear. So, this section shows the emergence of these other 2 beasts. So the first beast, who has the authority of the dragon, and then the false prophet, or the second beast, who also has some of the authority of the beast. And so again, that's a counterfeit to the Holy Spirit, the Son of the Spirit. Any questions about this chapter before I
Do
talk
we
about some things?
assume that the counterfeit Trinity works kind of the same as the Father, Son, Spirit Trinity? Like, that it's one and...
Yeah, I think that, it talks about the beast is made in the image dragon, and the false prophet has, they're all working together. And so they're different representations of the same evilness.
Okay.
So I think in that sense, it is a pretty good correspondence or anti-correspondence with the Trinity.
Is there any significance in the, one of the heads seeming to have a death blow and it being healed? It's almost like a resurrection.
Exactly. Yeah, there is significance to that. I think there's a couple of things. So one, it is the beast is the one who has this wound that seems like it was enough to merit dying, but then it was, in a sense, resurrected, and so it now has life again. So I think that's a clear antithesis here of the Son's wound and his wound leading to death, but then the resurrection. So there's that aspect. The other, that's kind of the spiritual aspect, which was also historical, that happened, but the other historical reference to that is probably to Nero, and that'll help us in just a moment. We'll talk about Nero. But Nero was the emperor from 54 to 68 AD. He was the first emperor to really persecute different pockets of Christians, and he persecuted Christians in the 60s. Much of Rome burned in Rome under him. He is believed also to have killed Peter and Paul. He was quite a despicable man. Killed his mom, some wives and children, typical stuff. And finally, at the end of his life, when he realized that his time had come, he got a knife and he stuck it in his throat, and he fell on the ground. And as he was bleeding, the chariots were coming to do worse to him. So that's why he was going to do it himself. But he was still alive when they arrived there. And instead of doing something, just let him die slowly as he bled to death in front of them. So he came to an end. But as much as he was hated by many, specifically Christians hated him, but they certainly believed him to be an Antichrist figure, he was revered by the common people because he gave them a lot of what they wanted. So he helped out with food, and he gave them gladiator events. So he was a master of the common person. And so they were very upset when he died because they liked him. And he was what's the word? Somewhat
Charismatic.
He was charismatic. He was also, I forget the term I'm trying to say, but you had no idea what he was going to do. But he was very theatrical. He was playful. He was a little different. And so the common person liked him. And so when he died, a rumor circulated that was heavily circulated, and for several decades it continued, that he actually did not die. And in fact, not only that, but over the course of the next few decades, there were at least 2 people who claimed to be Nero who went to Rome and said, "I'm Nero." And one of them was killed. The other one had amassed a substantial army to try to defeat the current emperor. And the rumor was that he would come from the east. And so what they believed was the only group that the Romans were never able to consistently colonize was a people called the Parthians. The Parthians were in the east. They were known for having beautiful horses, beautiful white horses. And the rumor was that Nero did not actually die because he didn't die in the city. He was outside of the city and no one saw him other than some of these people who were trying to take control. So it wasn't seen, it wasn't there publicly. They believed that he was wounded from this, but that he went to the east and he was going to come back one day with the Parthians, and the Parthians were going to destroy Rome. And as I mentioned, it's very interesting, but a couple of people, decades afterward, came back and said, "I am Nero." And back then, they didn't have DNA testing. So it wasn't as simple as, okay, and for one of the guys, he very much resembled Nero. And people who knew Nero, the way he talked, the way he looked and acted, and so he was able to deceive them. And it was very interesting. But that is probably the reference there, is he looked like he was dead, but he's come back to life again. And Nero, for Christians, would represent this arch, Antichrist figure, because he was the great persecutor. Killing Peter and Paul, he killed the vicar of Christ, and he killed Paul, the great evangelizer. So he deserved quite a legendary status. So those are the beast and the false prophet, and specifically that number, looking at verse 18, where it says this is a number of a person. And to me, I think that it's best not to look for anyone outside of the first century. And even then, I don't think it's so much we should be looking for a specific individual because, again, the book is meant to be interpreted figuratively. I think the best explanation is what I give here, and then if we want to be pressed, we can give a specific person. So the number 666, here's a few things that it means. One, the 3 digits signify totality and intensity. And this is why the opposite of that, in the book of Isaiah and also in Revelation, you say holy, holy, holy to God and so forth and so on. You don't have to say holy 4 times. You don't say it twice, but when you say holy 3 times, that signifies the completeness. So that was a common designation. So holy, 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 I don't have to say anything more. When you have 3 digits, that is signifying the totality of that. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is that the number 6 itself represents incompletion. It is number 7, which represents perfection or completeness, minus 1. And so there is an off number about it. So that's the second aspect. A third aspect, which this is just kind of something that I have seen, this may be not the best one, but the number could be kind of a counterfeit to the 7 spirits of God if it is in relation to the third beast is the one who's promulgating this. So maybe there's some reference there, but maybe not. The fourth point is a quote from Bruce Metzger, well-known New Testament scholar at Princeton Seminary, and he nails it, I believe. He says this number 666 is, quote, a symbol of the greatest imperfection, for it is the sacred number 7 less 1 repeated thrice. So I think that's really what's going on. And we should not be looking for people today, to say the least, who represent this number. And we should not be afraid of the number. Obviously, it's not something you want to name your kid. But other than that, there's no magic in the number, right? I mean, when Ronald Reagan moved after his presidency back to California, the address of the home was 666, so they changed it to like 673 or something like that. You don't have to do something like that. And I remember when I was a kid, my parents, we were looking to buy a car, and there was a used car, and the license plate was 666. And my dad said, "You're going to change that license plate number, right?" There's nothing magical about that number, but on the other hand, it's not something that you want to represent yourself or anyone around you. So I think that's what it's hitting at. If you want to push me into a corner and say, does the 666 refer to a person? Who is the person? I would say, okay, if it refers to someone, I think it's referring to Nero. And that can be concluded by a few things. In the ancient world, they had a practice called gematria, and that was a common practice where numbers were letters represented numeric value. And so A, for instance, in English would represent 1, B would represent 2, J would represent 10, and so forth. There's a way that you could count, just as we do with numbers, by using words. So that was a common practice, and some people have careers of going back in the Old Testament, and I don't know if you call them careers, but what they do with their time is they go back and they read the Old Testament in Hebrew, and they go to calculation. And they find the numeric value of these Hebrew characters, and they come up with very interesting things. Barack Obama is the Antichrist. It could be Genesis 1:1 or something along those lines, if you have the Hebrew characters counted correctly. So that is gematria, and if you use gematria for different names, you can come to the 666 representing Nero's name. Of course, you have to add a title. It has to be in Hebrew rather than in Greek, which is the language. But apart from that, it's pretty solid. Great skull. So this is, if you look at the scholars will say if it refers to someone, then it most likely refers to Caesar here. And so I've given you the Hebrew characters, and in English I've given you the capital means that that's the actual consonant. In Hebrew, they don't put vowels with the words. They put the vowels around the words. So, for instance, if this is Hebrew, this is the Hebrew for N, then if I want to put the E somewhere, I could put like a dot here, or I could put something like that. Those represents the vowel points. So that's why the lowercase there, that's clear, right? Here's my, and that dot right there is E. You're like, sure, kid, whatever.
I think I'm gonna play these numbers next week. I think I got a shot at maybe the lottery.
Well, like last week, wasn't the lottery? It was so big. You should have used that one. These could be, go for it. And so the Neron is referring to Nero's name, and then the Kaiser is his title. And you have to do it this way. You get 666. Now, here's what's interesting. And the N, for instance, represents 50 numeric value. The R represents 20, and so forth. What is interesting is I have in parentheses one of these. So, here's Nero's name, So that's the N, the R, and then the O, and then another N. When N is at the last, instead of looking like this, it goes down like that. So I have, this is Nero's name in Hebrew. This is in parentheses. If you take the N off, you now have a number 616 instead of 666 because the N represents 50. Now what is interesting, and it's actually true, is we have what's called a textual variant. And the textual variant in New Testament manuscripts is when we have lots of different manuscripts and there's one family of manuscripts that has a different reading. It's a variant reading. And so in a lot of manuscripts we have, instead of 666, it has 616. And it's not like we have a bunch of manuscripts where one has 573. So it's pretty substantial. We have 666 and another list of manuscripts has 616. If you take off the N, it's still grammatically correct. It's still appropriate. So, and that is Nero instead of Nero. And both of those are accurate. So we have attestation. I think someone found it in Dead Sea Scrolls, sure around the same time that the book of Revelation was, of that, where the N, it can either be there or it can be taken off. So there you have it. Nero is the person. If you change the language, you add a title, and you may or may not have one left.
Excellent.
But it's pretty good. We're standing on pretty good
Solid ground.
Solid.
solid ground there. That is the whole 666 thing. So I think it's better to understand it just represents the totality of evil. And again, if you want to push me in the corner, I'm thinking it's referring to Nero. Our time has run out. We think I have one more minute left. And just real quickly, I want to show you the last part there. I think that's the second coming. As I mentioned, every one of these cycles or the days of uncreation has a climax to it. And this one has the climax of the earth is harvesting. And so, I mean, it's pretty clear the whole world is harvested. So there's nothing left after chapter 14, but it keeps on going. And I think that this second coming, it represents Jesus. Jesus is represented as the Grim Reaper. And he has a sickle, and he's there to ply. And he's going to reap the wheat, and I think the wheat represents Christians, the righteous. And then there's another angel who will reap, who will harvest the grapes, and that's judgment. In the Bible, if you're harvesting grapes, it's always judgment. It's never good to be harvested if you're a grape. So I think that's what's going on here. There's FYI. And so that's the end of the world. That's the end of the cycle, and then it will go on. Of course, it doesn't bring to conclusion everything that the story, emerges here. The dragon has not been dealt with. The beast and false prophet will be dealt with in another cycle. They emerge here, but there's a resolution provided, and then we go into another cycle. So, again, just to conclude my approach, it's the end of the world is told from many different perspectives. And it's offered figuratively. At the end, it's all meant to recapitulate the beginning so that a new beginning can happen that is wonderful, beautiful, where everything is resolved. So Genesis 1-3 has the creation story, beautiful creation story, and we know what happens after that. Everything goes amok. Revelation 21 and 22, they recapitulate that, and now everything has been resolved. The end.